Okay, so I'm not sure how far each class will get through, so we're going to go ahead. I'm going to start with abolitionism. 3 stages. The first stage comes right after the American Revolution when the first wave of slaves were set free, and it lasts till 1817. It's the gradual approach where symbolized especially by New York and Pennsylvania, where we're gradually going to reduce slavery until it disappears. Stage 2 was 1817 to the 1830s. And stage 3 is the reform group, which should be part of your essay, and that's the move to immediately emancipate slaves. So we talked about the first stage, and we've talked about this in previous classes. Stage 2 was the colonization stage. In 1817, the American Colonization Society was founded. The goal was to end slavery and send the slaves, former slaves, back to Africa. Not a very successful thing. About 6,000 slaves were freed. Basically, this plan required buying the freedom of these slaves, and as a result, the society just didn't have a whole lot of money to do that. Stage 3 is the reform movement that we see develop in the 1830s. Abolitionists who demanded an immediate end to slavery and no compensation to the owners. The first 2 stages, stage 1, obviously gradual emancipation, would have happened over time, and slave owners would have had some time to kind of figure out an alternative. Stage 2, slaves who became free, their freedom would have to be purchased. So we probably talked about David Walker in class. He writes a book in 1829 which advocates violence as a method of ending slavery. This is the most important guy, William Lloyd Garrison. He founds the American Anti-Slavery Society, very religious, very radical, and we probably read an excerpt from The Liberator in class. Abolitionists had a 3-pronged attack. One was appeal to the religious sensibilities of Americans. Best example of this is Theodore Weld's book, American Slavery as It Is. Weld was helped by the Grimke sisters. Remember that reform movements, women held a very special place in reform movements, especially in the anti-slavery movement. This book emphasized the cruelty of slavery and sold about 100,000 copies in the North. Second tactic of the abolitionists in the North was to flood Congress and the South with anti-slavery petitions, and the Jacksonian Democrats reacted by imposing the gag rule on Congress, where we wouldn't discuss the issue for 8 years, from 1836 to 1844, and Southern postmasters basically didn't deliver any anti-slavery petitions that were sent. The third method that the abolitionists used, and this is obviously only some of them because this was breaking the law and it could often put your life at danger, and that was helping slaves escape through the Underground Railroad. And this is the map from your book. Some other important abolitionists, Frederick Douglass, who was an example of a slave who managed to successfully escape. He was a slave in Baltimore, Maryland. He escaped, eventually went to England, and his abolitionist friends in England bought him his freedom, came back to the United States, and in the 1840s and 1850s edited the North Star. Nat Turner's rebellion was a slave rebellion that took place in 1831, 6 months after the appearance of the Liberator. It's a very violent rebellion. It scares the woolly buggers of the Southerners. And there is going to be a debate in the Virginia legislature about possibly ending slavery, and the debate comes out of this rebellion. Basically, Virginia votes not to end slavery. Instead, what they do is tighten the restrictions on slaves, tighten the rules on slaves, especially the rules about giving slaves access to books and education, that kind of thing. The reason I wanted to put this on the line was we wouldn't get to talk about the women's rights movement. The women's rights movement kind of comes from the abolition of slavery movement. In the 1830s, women had been at the forefront of the anti-slavery movement. Best example will be the Grimke sisters. But they grew criticism for their role, especially for speaking in public. And in 1837, a group of Massachusetts Congregationalist ministers publicly criticized women and basically said, you know, your place is in the home. This got even worse at the anti-slavery meeting held in London, the World Anti-Slavery Meeting in 1840. The American delegation included lots of women who were leading the way in America, speaking out against slavery. Once they got to England, of course, we're talking about Victorian England, where women's place was squarely in the home, and the English abolitionists basically told the girls that they had to sit in the non-speaking section, and you can see that they had to speak in the non-speaking section, and their legs were covered up. Because Victorians were very concerned about bare legs and bare skin showing. Some of the American abolitionists, such as Wendell Phillips, were perfectly okay with the girls sitting in the non-speaking section, but William Lloyd Garrison, who was really the star of the show, he was supposed to be the special guest speaker, he refused to speak. After the World Anti-Slavery meeting, obviously some of the leading women, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, people like that, are going to organize a meeting to discuss women's rights, because they're going to be concerned that women are discussing everyone else's rights, but women didn't have rights themselves. And the last thing we should do as a class is look at the Declaration of Sentiments if we have time. And I've given you that. It's on the back of the Garrison handout. The Declaration of Sentiments is modeled, of course, on the Declaration of Independence, and it outlines the grievances that women had at this time period, and it outlines the rights they do not have. The most important thing that the Declaration called for is right at the end of the document. It calls for the right to vote. And this is basically going to split the abolitionist movement. William Lloyd Garrison's American Anti-Slavery Society is going to fight for the abolition of slavery, plus other issues such as women's suffrage. There are people who disagree with Garrison and focus entirely on ending slavery, and that group is the American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society. So obviously we have a tough situation for the abolitionists. The movement is split over the issue of women's rights and what role women's rights should play in the anti-slavery movement. Another group is going to break off and try and fix things politically. So we have in a couple of elections the Liberty Party, which is very much restricted to the northern states, and it wins a couple of electoral votes, I think, in the 1840s, especially in New York.